Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the heat source webinar, a data-driven approach to clean heat. This is the first of a series of 4 webinars we're delivering each consecutive Thursday. Today's webinar has a particular focus on the mainland Highlands of Scotland, so including Argyll Bute and Moray. Next week, as a trail, will be a bit of a rerun of this content, but with a specific focus on the islands, local authorities and our island communities in the Highlands and Islands. I'm Tom Warren. I work for Built Environment Smarter Transformation, and we're delivering the heat source programme in partnership with our funders Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and South of Scotland Enterprise. I'll introduce our other speakers as we come to them in the programme. So heat source, I'll tell you a little bit about heat source. Hopefully, as you found this webinar, you'll have read some about it on our various platforms. Heat source is a collaborative knowledge hub. We're here with the enterprise agencies to support the clean heat supply chain in Scotland, and webinars and our websites, the newsletter, in-person events, panel discussions, all form part of a suite of engagement and support for the clean heat supply chain. It's a pan-Scotland approach, and we're delighted that all 3 enterprise agencies are collaborating with the heat source programme. And the programme provides opportunities to engage with other partners within the clean heat supply chain or clients and collaborators looking to find out more and to move into that space. There is lots of useful past webinar recordings, case studies and other information around news and funding on the heat source website. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Keith Masson. I'd like to invite him to come on the screen now, who's going to take us through the report that we're sharing today. So Keith.
Brilliant, thanks Tom, and apologies, I'm going to leave my camera off for the time being because I'm having a wee bit of bandwidth issues at my side, but as soon as those are resolved I'll put my camera on and say hello to everyone. But yeah, good morning to you all. I'm really grateful to Heat Source for the opportunity to speak with you all today. And just very briefly, and by way of background for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Keith Masson and I'm Head of Net Zero Transition at Highlands and Islands Enterprise. And as many of you will know, Highlands and Islands Enterprise is the economic development agency for the north of Scotland and for all of its islands. So our area covers everywhere from Shetland in the north down to Orkney and into Highland, with Moray to the east, Argyll and Bute to the south, and Inchigal, Arran and the Cumbries to the west. And we're funded by the Scottish Government really to provide help and support to the businesses and communities of our areas through our area teams predominantly, really to help our businesses and communities to grow, to thrive and to be resilient. And as you'll all be aware, every town, every city, every village of Scotland does have its own unique opportunities and challenges. And we're really here to try and help maximise the opportunities and reduce the number of challenges fundamentally. But my role at HI is really pretty easy. First of all, from an operational perspective, I act as a lead to put HI on a credible pathway to net zero across all of our emissions sources. That's from decarbonising our buildings through how our staff travel to deliver our area teams to support our businesses and our communities to get on board with and benefit from the transition to net zero, whilst also really encouraging them to increasingly think about their resilience in the face of more extreme weather. For the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to dive into the exhilarating world of greenhouse gas emissions and what that baseline looks like across the Highlands and Islands, with a particular focus on heat, as Tom's already mentioned. Now, to me, this data isn't just about carbon footprints and pie charts. It's one of the really important ingredients in crafting the future economy of our region. So get ready to be blown away by the surprisingly thrilling world of emissions data. Just before all that, and in terms of context as to why I'm here today, back in 2023, High recognised the need to develop a more robust assessment of our regional emissions, both to progress and inform our new strategy, but also to ensure that our work with partners is more targeted and to enable us to focus on the clear areas of need around emissions reduction. And as a result of that, we commissioned DecusGen to undertake some work to baseline the greenhouse gas emissions profile for the region, for its constituent local authority areas, as well as the carbon sequestration and renewable energy potential that we have right across the patch. And I'll now very briefly summarise the findings from this research. Next slide, please, Tom. So just to kick off, and again for context, as you'll all be aware, in 2019 the Scottish Government declared a global climate emergency, and to address that is going to need transformational change right across all sectors of the economy. Following that declaration, the target to end Scotland's contribution to climate change was moved forward 5 years, from 2050 to 2045, really recognising that Scotland was in a naturally more strong position than the rest of the country to decarbonise more rapidly. Now, the Scottish Government have tasked public sector organisations like HIE and our local authorities with helping them to achieve that net zero target. And a big part of that, and hence why we produced this report, it really involves organisations developing an understanding of where, why, and how greenhouse gas emissions arise in day-to-day operations and through supply chains. Because fundamentally, you can't manage what you don't measure. So having a thorough understanding, not just of our own operational footprint, but the footprint of the whole region is a critical first step towards evidence-based collaborative action. So just in terms of what the study's telling us, I think it's firstly important to state that the UK local authority greenhouse gas emissions data set has been used to produce the bulk of the work through this regional baselining exercise. Because it's a consistent national source, it's updated annually, and it gives us scope for comparison with Scotland and with other parts of the UK. And at a very high level, the Highlands and Islands greenhouse gas emissions account for about 15% of Scotland's total, despite us having less than 10% of the population. And although our emissions have declined since 2005, we are as a region lagging behind Scotland overall. And in terms of our emissions, we do have fairly significant sub-regional variation, as you'll note at the bottom of the slide, with emissions being highest for the Highland region and lowest for Argyll and Bute. And if we look at this in terms of population, our per capita emissions are considerably higher than nationally. And again, there's quite important sub-regional variation there, with only Argyll and Bute having lower per capita emissions than for Scotland overall. And we'll touch on some of the reasons for that in future slides. Next slide, please, Tom. So if we look at the emissions profile for the region, and this is effectively our baseline, the top 5 sources of emissions do reflect those of Scotland overall, but the order and the scale is quite different. Now, before getting into this, I'm sure at least some of you are thinking this if previous groups I've presented to are anything to go by. But what do we mean by LULUCF? LULUCF stands for Land Use Change and Forestry, and the land use change and forestry sector covers emissions and removals of greenhouse gases which result from direct human-induced land-based activities. So in very simple terms, carbon is sequestered or locked away by forestry and grassland, while carbon losses occur on existing cropland and natural land that's converted to cropland or to settlements. So for the Highlands and Islands, agriculture and land use change and forestry account for almost half of our total emissions, with the other 3 categories of transport, domestic and industry accounting for a similar proportion, about 46%. And in terms of national emissions, the key takeaway from this slide is that we're making disproportionate contributions to LULUCF and to agriculture. But for other sources, our contribution is broadly proportionate to our overall population share. And just one final point to note, the public sector contributes a very small proportion to the overall emissions arising in the region. So despite being legislatively required to meet Scotland's 2045 target, if we do so, it won't really massively shift the dial in terms of whether the region gets to net zero or not. Next slide, please, Tom. So before we get into a more specific discussion around what the data is telling us from a heat perspective, it's really important to understand the sub-regional variation in emissions across the Highlands and Islands. Now, this is largely because there are so many interdependencies between the regions, and the fundamental reality is that net zero will only be possible by taking a collaborative pan-regional approach. So, for example, some regions are going to need to play a disproportionate role in emissions removals or sequestration of carbon if we're going to achieve a net zero position for the whole high area, whilst it's also likely that the supply chain and the installer base for heat decarbonisation works is likely to grow most in larger population centres, but will play a really important role right across the region. So from this slide, you'll all note that there are some fairly notable variations in our regional emissions profile. For some areas, we're seeing the dominance of particular emissions sources. For Shetland and the Western Isles, for example, that's LULUCF. For Orkney and Argyll and Bute, that's agriculture. Whereas for Highland and Moray, there's a much greater breadth in terms of those subsectoral contributions. In Highland, transport contributes the most, but LULUCF and agriculture closely follow. And in Moray, industry is the dominant source, but agriculture isn't terribly far behind. And for Argyll and Bute and Moray, we also see where land management makes a big difference. In both those areas, forestry is already sequestering carbon and helping to balance emissions from other sectors. Next slide, please, Tom. So now on to something that touches us all and one of the key challenges and opportunities over the coming decades. The inescapable conclusion from the study is that reducing the emissions we generate from running our homes and businesses is going to be a huge challenge for the Highlands and Islands. And for the purposes of this research, we assessed the two primary sources of energy used in residential properties, that being electricity and fossil fuels for heat. And although our domestic emissions are proportionate to our share of Scotland's dwellings, we're going to have a harder job than the rest of Scotland to bring our homes up to appropriate energy efficiency standards. Currently, only about a quarter of our dwellings have an EPC rating of C or above, compared to about 2/5 nationally. And there are a few different factors that drive that, including the age, the construction, and the nature of our housing stock. But we also have a much greater reliance on fossil fuels, such as oil and coal for heating, and a higher proportion of our properties suffer from exposure to wind-driven rain, which means it takes more energy to heat those homes. And that's really partly why we have much higher levels of fuel poverty and extreme fuel poverty within the region. And the overriding message, I think, from this analysis is that much of the region's emissions arise from a dependency on carbon-intensive fossil fuels, particularly for space heating, but also in our industrial and manufacturing processes. In many areas, the remoteness from on-grid energy supply and the quality and the age of our buildings, whether those are commercial premises or residential dwellings, is a major contributory factor in energy consumption and thus our overall carbon emissions profile. And for residential dwellings in particular, energy efficiency, insulation, and transition to low carbon means of heating and lighting is really going to have to be an area of critical focus and is a huge opportunity for our business base going forward. For example, a significant challenge to the financial and greenhouse gas emissions savings arising from energy efficiency is the lack of a local supply chain to undertake a lot of that work across the region. And that's already impacting on the ability to reduce stationary energy use and greenhouse gas emissions across the Highlands and Islands, as well as householders and businesses' ability to benefit from national funding, such as that offered by Home Energy Scotland and Business Energy Scotland. However, and there's a common theme here, this is a largely untapped opportunity within the region. Now, to me, our analysis, coupled with aggregated up household data at a place-based level, starts to paint a really strong picture of the economic opportunity around clean heat and retrofit. And we really need to come together more robustly to provide confidence to current installers and potential new entrants to the market that there's a really credible and largely untapped 15 to 20-year pipeline of work just waiting to be realised in the region. Next slide, please, Tom. So it'll come as no surprise to you all that we have a high proportion of older dwellings in the Highlands and Islands. About 21% of our dwellings are pre-1919 compared to 18% nationally. And in addition to the higher proportion of older dwellings, there's also a higher proportion of dwellings with poor or no wall insulation. For example, 50% of our residential properties have insulated walls compared to 58% across the whole of Scotland. And dwellings in island and remote rural parts of the region, including on the mainland, are less likely to have insulated walls than those in accessible rural areas and in our small towns and urban locations. So Dwellings in the Highlands and Islands are more likely to have solid walls, 31% do, and solid floors, 22% do, than dwellings across Scotland overall, where 26% have solid walls and 17% have solid floors. So the combination of a high proportion of older dwellings with solid walls and floors and that are less likely to have wall insulation results in a housing stock in the Highlands and Islands that is going to be less energy efficient than the housing stock of Scotland as a whole. And additionally, those dwellings, in some cases, are likely to be the least suited to current retrofitting processes, or at the very least require more expensive interventions. Next slide, please, Tom. So this slide shows the main fuel type by sub-region in the Highlands and Islands. And whilst mains gas is the most common type of fuel within the region, electricity and oil account for a significant proportion of the heat sources for residential properties. And that reliance on high carbon fuel sources like heating oil and solid fuels presents an acute issue in terms of domestic carbon emissions, particularly given the high proportion of dwellings in island, remote, rural and accessible rural areas that rely on such fuels as their main fuel type. And that's further exacerbated when we consider that around a fifth of dwellings in the Highlands and Islands use such fuels as their secondary fuel type. So when considering energy efficiency and alternative fuel measures, the extent to which owner-occupiers and private landlords can be influenced is going to be a key factor. And with some research that we undertook at HIE in 2022 indicated that only 6% of households were planning to switch their fuel type over the next 2 or 3 years. And for those who weren't planning to switch, the barriers that they mentioned included cost, 53%, not wanting to change, 34%, and a lack of financial support from government, 30%. So really to try and summarise what the research is telling us in terms of heat, it's important to reflect on the fact that emissions from residential dwellings are considerably higher per dwelling than elsewhere in Scotland. So mean emissions per dwelling are 6 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent in the Highlands and Islands against a figure of 4.3 tonnes per dwelling in Scotland overall, almost 50% higher. And as highlighted by this in the previous slide, the age, the nature and the condition of our housing stock, as well as differences in the main fuel and heating systems, make a significant contribution to the higher residential emission rates in the region. And that is compounded by the proportion of dwellings in island or more remote areas. Just under 2/3 of the region's residential dwellings are in remote areas, either in remote towns, 20%, or in remote rural areas, 45%, which makes the rollout or the uptake of energy efficiency or sustainability measures more difficult to achieve at scale. And that also means that many of the region's dwellings are in exposed or very exposed locations, and their exposure to wind-driven rain is an influencing factor in their energy consumption and energy efficiency, as I mentioned before. So consequently, many of the factors that distinguish the Highlands and Islands from the rest of Scotland mean that by comparative measure, it has a higher greenhouse gas emissions footprint, namely a disparate population, its geography and its remoteness, its climate and greater exposure to wind-driven rain, the reliance on carbon-intensive fuels, more intensive energy industries in certain areas, for example, whisky, older, more traditional residential dwellings and other buildings, a greater dependency on higher carbon forms of transport, and a lack of mains connection for gas in such a significant proportion of the region. And those factors really underline the scale of the challenge in tackling greenhouse gas emissions within our built estate. Next slide, please, Tom. So I'm conscious of time, and you'll be pleased to hear I've only got a couple of slides to run through. But it would be remiss not to mention the potential impact and scale of renewable energy generation in the region. It really can't be understated, and we are going to make a significant and disproportionate contribution to national decarbonisation ambition in terms of our renewable energy potential. And without the contribution from the Highlands and Islands, I think it's fair to say that national targets, both in terms of decarbonisation and more specifically in terms of greening heat, are unlikely to be met. So whilst onshore wind is currently the largest source of renewable generation at the moment, offshore wind is expected to increase to a far greater scale than other technologies. But we are expecting significant increases in anticipated generation and supply and storage capacity across nearly all renewable energy technologies over the coming years. And if all the current pipeline activity is realised, generation capacity in the region would increase more than fourfold, and that will result in growth across all parts of the region. And when we recognise the natural competitive advantage for the Highlands and Islands, the creation of renewable energy schemes cuts across a range of regional and national policy objectives. And as Scotland reduces its reliance on fossil fuels, that's going to create opportunities for jobs within the Highlands and Islands that are well positioned to benefit from this realignment. And the development and the subsequent operation of these renewable energy schemes therefore creates really good opportunities throughout the life cycle of projects and is naturally going to increase demand for other services and much more economic action on the ground right across the region. Next slide, please, Tom. So this is my final slide. And the research that I've summarised is extremely detailed, and this has only been and could only ever be a very high-level overview. But what I hope the research does is provide a really strong baseline for the first time of the greenhouse gas emissions profile for the region and a more evidenced understanding of where we need to target efforts to shift the dial. And on this slide, I've tried to summarise the critical next steps, both for HI as well as the Highlands and Islands Regional Economic Partnership, or HIREP, if we're going to see a significant downward trend in emissions when it comes to repeating this exercise in future years. The work really highlights a range of considerations and emerging priority areas, and these are important both for the evolving regional economic strategy, but as well as for HI's own approach to transitioning to net zero. But to me, and I would hope that many of you on the call today will agree, net zero isn't going to happen if we continue on the current trajectory of attempting to address it as individual organisations, businesses or householders. It's going to need much more sophistication. It's going to need better coordination and aggregation of data to inform much better place-based approaches. And to that end, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Ruta from the Highland Council shortly in terms of how they're preparing for this through their local heat and energy efficiency strategy and the expected role of both the public and the private sectors to deliver that. But over and above that, and coupled with the generation of so much more renewable energy within the region, it's inescapable that we're going to need a strategic approach to deliver a strengthened distribution network to accommodate the shift to renewable heat, not to mention the increased uptake of EVs. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Stuart at SSEN in terms of their own work in that respect and how we can all productively and proactively feed into it. So thank you all very much for your attention, and I'll now pass back to Tom.
Thank you, Keith. Apologies for the slight delay there. We're aware also that there's a bit of a slight issue with the screen sharing, so we're just looking to rectify that in the background here. All the slides will be shared with everyone who's signed up after the event. I think we were just slightly missing the top and the bottom of the slides in that last presentation, but hopefully the core content was still visible, so apologies for that. Bear with me a minute here. So I think my colleagues are just going to bring up the next slides, and then Ruta from Highland Council will start, and she can introduce herself in a moment. Just waiting for the to see on the slide sharing here what's the best approach here. So both in a minute. Yeah, we're just getting this set up. So again, we've got the chat function on the webinar here, so please do post questions to us as we go. Anything in response to what you've seen from Keith or the other two presenters when we come to them. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So yeah, but to do that, you need to put your questions into the chat, and then we'll work through those at the end of the session. And again, just while we're waiting, just to trial, this is part one in this webinar series. The next one, which is relevant to our Highlands mainland audience, is going to be on the 19th of September. So do join us for that one. If we can just keep going a few slides further, and we'll, next one, there we go, that's perfect. So, oh, back one, no, seems to be going the wrong way now. So we've got Rita from Highland Council. Right, there we go, that's the start for Rita. So Rita, if you'd like to come on the screen, and we'll let you introduce yourself. Thank you, everyone.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tom. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Ruta Burbaite, and I am the Climate Change Coordinator for the Local Heat and Energy Efficiency Strategy and Delivery Plan with the Highland Council. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the Highland Council LHEES and approach we're going to take towards delivery. Next slide, please, Tom. So where it all started. So the Local Heat and Energy Efficiency Strategy Scotland Order 2022 places a legal duty on all Scottish local authorities to produce and publish their LHEES and delivery plan by the end of December 2023. As established in the LHEES Scotland Order 2022, LHEES has a two-part structure. So it's a strategy and delivery plan. A strategy underpins an area-based approach to heat and energy efficiency planning and delivery and sets out the long-term plan for decarbonising heating buildings and improving their energy efficiency across an entire local authority area. And a delivery plan which sets out how a local authority proposes to support implementation of the strategy. Next slide, please, Tom. So the Highland Council published its first LHEES and high-level delivery plan in December 2023. We are currently developing the detailed delivery plan to include place-based projects. Our delivery plan is intended as a short to medium-term delivery of activities and projects that the Council has greatest influence. Our LHEES is also framed around what can be delivered now, given the existing policy landscape and funding, and it will cover 24-28 delivery. Next slide, please, Tom. So during the development of our LHEES, we mainly followed steps identified in the LHEES methodology and guidance published by Zero Waste Scotland on behalf of the Scottish Government, and we also utilised a consultant to support us with the data analysis. And here you can see that the first 4 stages feed into the strategy, and then stages basically from stage 3 to say stage 7 feeds into the delivery plan. Next slide, please, Tom. Here on the slide, you can see some of the data sources that we used to support the analysis. And just to let you know that the LHEES is a data-driven exercise. So we spend quite a lot of time collecting, but also sense-checking data to make sure it is as accurate as possible. And next slide, please, Tom. However, what we found was that the quality of data was poor in some instances. So to overcome some of the data limitations, the Highland Council has developed a domestic Power BI tool to cleanse the domestic data to allow the Council to identify the most inefficient properties across the region and support place planning. This tool includes all domestic tenure properties across the Highlands. The tool is not currently publicly available because it is still in the development, but the intention is that it will become publicly available. So anyone will be able to go on the tool, find a property, to see how efficient or inefficient it is. But there's also a tab to identify what funding opportunities might be available for you to insulate your home or upgrade heating. Next slide, please, Tom. So for the Highland Council, the LHEES is a long-term strategic framework for decarbonising heating buildings and improving energy efficiency is framed around two strategic priorities, a fabric-first approach and heat decarbonisation. So within the analysis, for instance, we identified that over 19,000 of the gas grid properties and over 24,000 on the gas grid properties are classed as highly suited for heat pump retrofit. This means that these properties have good levels of insulation and a distribution system. We also looked at secondary opportunities, so we identified over 29 of the gas grid properties and over 23 on the gas properties that have secondary suitability. So it means that these properties require a significant amount of energy efficiency measures to be installed before before we touch any heating. And we also looked at a potential deployment of heat networks. So we mainly focused on buildings that the council owns or has some control over, and we identified 7 potential heat network zones within the Highlands. But we also looked at potential and suitability for smaller scale heat networks. The 7 identified heat network zones are in Inverness, Dingwall, Fort William, Invergordon, and areas that might be suitable for smaller scale heat network deployment were Thurso, Wick, Isle of Skye, Muirvord, Elness, and so on. Just to let you know that the heat network delivery areas included in our delivery are still presented at strategic level prior to any feasibility work or funding available to progress them further. So we are doing quite a bit of work to investigate potential deployment just now. Secondly, the scope of the LHEES is broad and cuts across our services and local activities, and growing demand in the Highlands puts electricity grid under pressure. The increased use of electricity and connection delays require a need for new and upgraded connections to distribution and transmission networks, as well as a coordinated approach between retrofit projects, new developments, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The Highland Council's Climate Change and Energy team is working closely with Stuart and his team at SSEN to plan future projects. And I think the key step, the next step for us will be to undertake a local area energy planning to use the LHEES outputs to inform and shape a council's transition to net zero. Next slide, please, Tom. Thank you. For us, LHEES gives us a strategic opportunity to use the LHEES findings to build projects and programs in areas of need. So our delivery plan is supported by aligning areas against delivery programs such as the Energy Efficient Scotland Area-Based Scheme, and also other funding opportunities such as the Social Housing Net Heat Fund, for instance. Also aligning against any future regulation requirements to demonstrate areas that may require focus and investment. So a bit here as ISH or the Social Housing Net Zero standard, but also commitments and targets identified in the heat and building strategy. We also focus on prioritizing areas depending on local drivers and targeted geographic areas. So in this case would be fuel poverty areas, because we have high levels of fuel poverty in the Highlands. So we are looking at those areas and also extreme fuel poverty areas as well. But also we need to take various other considerations into account, such as constraints, resources, and new and future developments that could impact any decision making. Next slide, please, Tom. This slide gives you a quick overview of what is coming. So I'll talk you through some of the points here. We've identified that we have over 129,000 domestic buildings in the Highland Council area, and the council owns just over 15,000 of them. With the analysis we completed, we can see that around 63% of domestic buildings we need to be improved because their energy performance certificate ratings were D to G, which are quite low. Also, with the development of the Inverness and Cromarty Firth Greenport, it is estimated that an additional 24 houses will need to be built. Currently, I think we built around 10,000 houses, sorry, 5,000 houses in the past 10 years. So you can see that, to meet the demand, more houses will need to be built in the region. In terms of the non-domestic stock heat decarbonisation, so there are over 16,000 non-domestic buildings in the Highlands, and the council owns just over 1,000 of them. We as a council, have control over our own estate. So we are currently looking at options. So we are doing 300 surveys every 2 years to understand our own stock conditions. And for the buildings that we don't have control or influence, we highly encourage to speak to Business Energy Scotland, or for community buildings with Local Energy Scotland, to see what technical or also funding opportunity, technical support or funding opportunities are out there. And lastly, it is estimated that that generation capacity for community energy will increase by 100% by 2030. Next slide, please, Tom. So in general, the LHEES enables place-based and people-central planning for future energy capacity by maximizing current and future opportunities to bring economic growth and a wide range benefits to households, communities and businesses, but also the whole energy system. Energy efficiency measures make buildings easier to keep warm, reducing the demand for heat. They help support good physical and mental health, primarily by creating healthy indoor living environments with healthy air temperatures, humidity and noise levels, and improved air quality. To reach net zero carbon emissions by 2045, we will need to change the way we heat our homes and buildings. And improving your home will also improve your energy rating. And one of the council priorities at the moment is to reduce fuel poverty in the region. So we are looking at various funding opportunities and utilizing external funding where we can to support domestic and non-domestic buildings heat decarbonisation. However, there are various challenges associated, such as skill gaps, lack of supply chain. We still pay higher costs for measures such as heat pumps and insulation measures, but there's also some grid constraints and other challenges. But we are working to overcome some of the barriers, so hopefully, it will help us to deliver what we aim to deliver in the next 5 or 10 years. So if you have any specific questions or any queries, feel free to get in touch. On this slide, you can see my email address and our generic LHEES inbox. So that's all from me today. Thank you so much for listening. Apologies, Tom. I think
that's
my
okay.
presentation was a bit longer.
Keen to move on to Stuart from SSEN, and yeah, Ruta's details will be shared with the slide deck, and we can pick up anything in the Q&A shortly. So, Stuart, welcome to the webinar. I'm not sure if you want to turn your camera on. Yeah, you've got better bandwidth than some of our other presenters, so that's fantastic. So, Stuart, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. Thanks also to Ruta and Keith for teeing me up so nicely to talk about our strategic network planning process. So good morning everyone, my name's Stuart Gilfillan. I work for Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks within our distribution business. I'm going to give a bit of background today on our strategic network planning process, how this relates to decarbonisation of heat, as well as how you can get involved in that process. So move on please. Yeah, so firstly, just a very brief bit of background. So we are the distribution network operator, or the DNO, for the north of Scotland, and our license area covers very roughly everything north of Stirling-ish. So what a DNO is we own, operate and maintain the distribution network that carries electricity from the higher voltage cross-country transmission network down through the various voltage levels, ultimately to your homes and businesses. But the particularly interesting part of this slide, which might have been cut off the bottom, but I can explain it, is around low carbon technologies and how our network's having to adapt to that and the change in the way that our network's being used. So that's changed the way that we've had to operate, which I'll expand upon on the next slide. Yeah, so the change in the way that the network's being used has led to a transition from the traditional position of the DNO, the distribution network operator, to more of a DSO, or distribution system operator model. This DSO model is where we take a kind of whole system view of the wider energy picture and the electricity network's role within it, which is essential to drive in performance and efficiency from the network. And also the need for our network to respond to increasing low carbon technology demands such as heat pumps, EVs. Distributed generation means we need to take a more strategic approach to planning out this network and then forecasting the future requirements that there will be on this network. So it's really the point in green on the little DSO bubble that I want to talk you through today around forecasting and planning future needs of the network. Clearly decarbonising heat is going to be a key consideration within that. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the team that I work within this DSO function is the whole system team, and we're responsible for the longer term strategic planning of the network to respond to your local requirements. We look to do this through our strategic planning process on the screen here, which I'll go through. So developing future forecasts is really the base on which our strategic planning process is built. This is primarily done through something called our Distribution Future Energy Scenarios Model, or DFES. What this is really a giant data model built on insights provided to us by local stakeholders on what is planned in the energy picture for their local area. What we do is combine these insights with our own connections data and research done by our consultant Regen, who's a few of you have probably been in touch with, to create modelled scenarios of what growth on our network will look like out to 2050. What I would say, as with all data models, the outputs of this model are only as good as the inputs, so we're constantly looking to refine this with data and insights from you guys. So then using these DFES projections, we then create something called strategic development plans, in which we look to create a high level plan for how the network will actually respond to those changes in demands and work through various options to meet these requirements. Consultation with local stakeholders on these plans is a key part of the process. And the first batch of our strategic development plans is actually due out for consultation next week. So please watch this space, as your comments are very much encouraged and appreciated on this. What comes next is the high-level options from these strategic development plans are then developed into more detailed options to address the capacity needs that have been identified. And the decisions are then published as part of our distribution networks options assessment process, where again, we're constantly seeking feedback to refine. Ultimately then these projects are developed and consulted on through this process, and then they move forward to delivery to actually deliver the capacity that's needed on the network for your decarbonisation priorities. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to emphasize the point here that we're really reliant on users of our network sharing their insights and future requirements with us in order to both develop our high-level DFED scenarios that I mentioned, but also to enhance some of our more regionally specific strategic development plan documents. Point I'd like to make here really is that these planning documents are living documents. They're not something that's going to be fixed in stone once they're written. So they'll be updated at least annually. So even if you've got data or plans, particularly as you look longer into the future that are a little more uncertain, then please do share them with us, because we understand, particularly as you look further into the future, it can be hard to nail down exactly, but what we're looking for is sometimes just to paint a big picture. So it's not a connection application you're committing to here if you share plans and data with us. It's really a two-way information sharing situation that we're trying to facilitate, in which your future energy plans inform our future plans for the network and vice versa. Next slide, please. So a tool we're developing as part of this strategic planning process is the Local Energy Net Zero Accelerator, or LHEES tool, which has been designed to help local authorities develop their strategic net zero plans, such as LHEES or local area energy plans, or just more sort of individual discrete projects, and also a platform that can then allow local authorities to give us visibility of their long-term plans. It's a geospatial planning tool that provides users with the data that they need to make decisions about where and when new energy assets or projects can be most effectively planned. At the moment, this tool is in sort of beta development phase, I would say. So we can only offer access to local authorities in our license areas, but we're actively exploring options for expanding this access further. So my ask would be, if you're a local authority within our license area and haven't yet got access, please reach out. Likewise, if you're not a local authority but feel this platform could be of use to you in helping develop your future energy plans and informing our network planning, please also reach out, as we're looking to understand the needs case for expanding access in the future. What I would say is we think that this LHEES tool can be a really useful tool in the strategic planning process, but it's not the be-all and end-all. So if you would prefer just a more informal conversation with our team around your future plans, and indeed our future plans, please reach out. And likewise, if you've already developed future plans in more detail and you want to go through them with us, then we'd be really keen to have that conversation too. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's been a whistle-stop tour. I'm conscious of time through our strategic planning process. Probably covered a lot in quite a short space of time, and maybe haven't specifically focused on decarbonisation of heat, but clearly heat is a key consideration for us in our network planning, alongside various other vectors: generation, transport, new development. The list sort of goes on and on. So yeah, just encourage you to reach out to us via this email if you'd like to have a further conversation with us on strategic energy planning. And yeah, watch out for the first batch of strategic development plan consultations next week, and then future consultations as we roll the process out over our whole license area. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. If I can ask you to stay on screen as we go into Q&A. In terms of the screen sharing, could I maybe just ask my colleagues just if we stop screen sharing for a minute, and then if Keith, you're able to come on screen as well. So we've got a first question here. There's a bit to this, so I'm just checking it through here. As part of an organisation involved in research and education, which has multiple net zero decarbonisation projects, we've tried the usual energy efficiency funding methods, which are suggesting kind of Business Energy Scotland, the SALEX Fund, and others, but they're ineligible for these. So the question here being, so a bit of scene setting, there will be other organisations in a similar position, and obviously this is, in terms of access to funding, I think this is the question here. Yeah, so given, and I guess given the news this week in terms of Scottish Government budgets and kind of funding within the public sector, that funding gap, that has to be filled. There's not a direct question. I guess it's a sort of statement here, but yeah, funding. So I guess to turn that into a question for us all, and maybe come to you, Keith, in terms of Highlands and Islands Enterprise as the kind of economic development agency lead, is funding is obviously needed for businesses and the public sector to reach these targets. What are the kind of options on funding? Briefly, if there's anything you can talk to on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and be brief. I mean, it's a constantly evolving picture. I think it's important to say. So whilst the number of schemes, government or agency related to help businesses and social enterprises and communities decarbonise is probably lower than it's ever been, it is evolving all the time. And I think from High's perspective, we're in the process of relaunching our Green Grant Fund, which is effectively designed to enable businesses and community groups to install measures which will reduce their carbon footprint, and ideally looking for those organisations to be taking a whole building approach to eradicate the use of fossil fuels and improve the thermal efficiency of buildings.
Yeah, I've lost your audio, Keith, so I'll move on. Oh, you're with us again.
Keeping abreast of all the funding that is available. And can you hear me?
Yes, you're back. You're back with us.
Yeah.
I think I'll move on to a question that I've got for Stuart, just because your connection's not great there, Keith. Apologies. So, Stuart, the Lenser tool looks fantastic, and I've had some insights from previous presentations on that. Just a general question that we've got here is: does that cover the whole of the Highlands and Islands in terms of the SSE and region, or is it kind of is it kind of being rolled out, in stages?
So it's been made available to all local authorities within our North of Scotland licence area. So that basically does cover the whole of the Highlands and Islands. Yes, yeah. Our licence area is kind of on the mainland, north of Stirling, and then pretty much all the inhabited islands. So
yeah, no, that's perfect, Stuart. Well, that answers that one, and you answered in your presentation about which organisations are eligible to access that, but obviously those who maybe have an interest further down the line. So hopefully follow up on that. Quick question for Ruta. You mentioned you've identified 7 heat network zones. The question is, what fuel sources are you considering for these? I mean, maybe it's too early a stage, but if you can answer on that one.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question. So we haven't specifically looked at what sources exactly, we would be looking to utilize. However, with the work, just to give some background, we've received some funding from the Scottish Government to undertake a citywide feasibility study for Inverness. And 3 of the heat network zones that we identified within the analysis are actually in Inverness. So we are currently exploring what options might be applicable, but just to kind of highlight that we will be looking at multiple sources, and that could be heat from waste, geothermal energy, river sewers, and so on. Yeah. So we will be investigating potential sources, but it will be multiple sources.
An early stage then. Yeah, and we had another question actually around whether geothermal energy was being considered, but you've mentioned that there. Obviously, I guess it depends on the location of those networks and the geology and all the
Sorry,
rest.
can I just add something to
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so geothermal is also an option, and we did a bit of work with the University of Aberdeen on geothermal stuff. So the study took place in April, so we are waiting for final results. We mainly concentrated around Bug Park in Inverness, and we did some tests there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, apologies for the bit of the kind of handover delay earlier on in the webinar. Keith, I think, has possibly dropped off the call with his connection. Could I ask my colleagues just to bring up the polls? We're just going to share a quick poll on screen. So I'll just give you all a few minutes to respond to that. Okay, whilst that's whilst the results of that, whilst that's just been closed out, again, just a reminder that the next heat in the Highlands, the sort of second part, the follow-up to today's introduction, is on Thursday the 19th, 10 till 11, so the same time in a fortnight's time, and we'll have myself and Keith will be joining again to lead that, but we'll also be joined by the Energy Savings Trust, an Inverness-based clean heat company, RI Cruden, and a direct electric company to talk about their products and what they do, called Connected Response. So I hope some of you will be joining us again in a fortnight's time. Keith, I can see is back with us now, so thank you again. I'd just like to thank all of our speakers, so Keith, Rita and Stuart, thank you for your time. I'd like to thank the funders of Heat Source, so Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Scottish Enterprise and South of Scotland Enterprise. Yeah, so I think that draws to an end today's session. So we'll just leave it as that for now. Thank you, everyone.